You can take a man's land with money, but you can never buy the memories buried beneath it. The black pickup rolled slowly across the gravel driveway as the first rays of dawn painted the Wyoming sky with streaks of amber and pale blue. Marcus Reed rested one weathered hand on the steering wheel, his calm eyes sweeping over the rolling pasture that had belonged to his family for nearly 70 years. Every fence post, every oak tree, every weathered barn board carried a memory that no appraisal could ever measure. His grandfather had cleared this land with little more than determination and worn-out tools after returning home from World War II. His father had rebuilt the ranch after a wildfire nearly erased everything. Marcus himself had left it behind for over a decade to serve as a Navy SEAL, completing missions he would never speak about, only to return with one promise to the people who had raised him. The ranch would never leave the Reed family. That promise had become more valuable than any fortune. The quiet was interrupted by the distant rumble of an expensive engine climbing the dirt road. A long black luxury SUV emerged from behind a line of cottonwood trees, its polished paint reflecting the morning light as if it didn't belong anywhere near the rugged countryside. Marcus watched without surprise. He had expected this visit. The vehicle stopped several feet from the front porch, and after a brief pause, a tall white man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks before glancing across the property with the detached confidence of someone studying numbers instead of lives. His name was Richard Caldwell, a wealthy real estate developer whose growing empire had quietly consumed thousands of acres across the region. Standing beside him was another white man carrying a polished leather briefcase that looked strangely out of place among the cattle pens and dusty boots. Richard offered a practiced smile. "Mr. Reed," he called, extending his hand. "Beautiful place you've got here." Marcus stepped onto the porch, but made no move to shake the offered hand. "Morning." Richard lowered his hand without showing offense. "I'll get straight to the point. My company would like to purchase your ranch. We believe it fits perfectly into an exciting development project that will benefit this entire county." The assistant clicked open the leather case, revealing neatly stacked legal documents beside a certified cashier's check whose numbers stretched farther than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Richard slowly turned the check so Marcus could read it. $28 million, he said smoothly. Tax advisors, relocation assistance, lifetime financial security. You'll never have to worry about another bill again. Marcus looked down at the paper for only a second before lifting his eyes back toward the endless fields beyond them. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut hay across the porch, mixing with the distant sounds of cattle grazing peacefully beneath the wide western sky. He remembered chasing calves beside his father before he was old enough to reach the saddle. He remembered his mother laughing while hanging laundry behind the farmhouse. He remembered the folded American flag presented to his grandmother after his grandfather's funeral. Every memory lived here. Richard mistook the silence for hesitation. "Everyone has a price," he said quietly. Marcus finally spoke. His voice remained calm, steady, almost gentle. "No." Richard blinked once, surprised by how quickly the answer came. "Perhaps you misunderstood the number." Marcus slowly shook his head. "I understood it perfectly." Richard folded his hands. "Then tell me your number." Marcus looked directly into his eyes. "This ranch isn't for sale." The smile disappeared from Richard Caldwell's face. For the first time that morning, the silence felt different, heavier somehow, as though the wind itself had stopped listening. His assistant quietly closed the briefcase, while Richard studied Marcus with a colder expression than before. Without another word, he turned, stepped back into the waiting SUV, and the vehicle rolled down the gravel road until it disappeared beyond the trees, leaving only drifting dust hanging over the driveway. Marcus remained on the porch long after the engine noise had faded, unaware that somewhere beyond the ridge, another pair of eyes had been watching the entire conversation through a long-range camera lens, recording every second before making a single phone call that would change everything by sunrise. Before we continue, if you enjoy powerful stories that reveal the strength of the human spirit and the choices that shape our lives, subscribe to Narralight. Every story has a lesson, every choice has a consequence, and sometimes the smallest moment changes everything. Now, let's see what happens next. Marcus did not spend the rest of the morning wondering whether Richard Caldwell would return. Experience had taught him that people who believed money could solve every problem rarely accepted the word no the first time. Instead, they simply looked for another way to hear yes. He walked the fence line with the same steady pace he had followed since returning from military service, stopping every few yards to inspect old cedar posts that had weathered decades of Wyoming winters. A loose wire received careful attention. A sagging gate was tightened with practiced hands. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary rancher taking care of ordinary chores. But beneath that quiet routine, his instincts never truly rested. Years of disciplined training had taught him that the smallest change in an environment often arrived long before real trouble did. Around noon, his old Australian shepherd, Ranger, lifted his head from beneath the porch and stared toward the county road. The dog did not bark. He simply watched, ears forward, body perfectly still. Marcus followed his gaze. A white utility truck rolled past the ranch entrance slower than necessary before continuing another half-mile. 10 minutes later, the same truck returned from the opposite direction. The driver never stopped. He never waved. He only looked. Marcus memorized the license plate without reaching for a notebook. By late afternoon, another unfamiliar vehicle appeared, this time a dark gray pickup with heavily tinted windows. It paused briefly at the mailbox before driving away. The mailbox itself remained untouched, yet Marcus noticed fresh tire tracks where no vehicle had parked before. None of these moments meant anything by themselves, but together they formed a pattern that felt impossible to ignore. As the sun drifted lower behind the mountains, Marcus climbed the small hill overlooking the ranch house. The wind carried the smell of sagebrush across the open fields while golden light stretched long shadows over the grazing cattle. From that vantage point, he could see nearly every acre his family had protected through generations of sacrifice. He also noticed something new. A tiny object hovered several hundred feet above the western pasture, barely visible against the fading sky. Most people would have mistaken it for a large bird. Marcus did not. The movement was too precise, too controlled. A drone circled once, paused as though studying the property, then quietly disappeared beyond the ridge before darkness settled across the valley. Marcus said nothing. He simply returned to the house and closed the front door. Inside, the ranch felt exactly as it always had. Family photographs lined the hallway. A faded Navy photograph rested beside his father's old pocket watch on the fireplace mantel. The grandfather clock ticked with comforting consistency, measuring time the same way it had for nearly 40 years. Marcus brewed fresh coffee, even though evening had arrived. Sitting at the kitchen table, he unfolded a county survey map of the surrounding properties and quietly marked each unusual sighting from the day. No fear crossed his face, only patience. Outside, the night grew unusually quiet. Even the coyotes that normally called across the hills remained silent. Around 10 o'clock, Ranger suddenly stood and faced the front window. His tail stayed low. Again, no barking. Marcus switched off the kitchen light without hesitation. Darkness filled the room, allowing him to see beyond the glass instead of his own reflection. Far beyond the front gate, almost half a mile away, two pairs of headlights remained parked along the county road without moving. They stayed there for several minutes before disappearing into the night. Marcus slowly drew the curtains closed, finished the last sip of coffee, and looked once more at the family photograph resting on the mantel. His father's words echoed clearly in his memory. When people stop asking politely, "Son, pay attention to what they do next." Marcus locked the front door, checked every window out of habit rather than fear, and headed upstairs as the ranch settled into silence, never realizing that before the first hint of daylight touched the Wyoming horizon, dozens more vehicles had already begun moving toward the valley from every direction. Marcus awoke before sunrise, just as he had every morning since leaving military service. But this morning the silence felt different. It was not peaceful. It was waiting. Ranger stood beside the front door without moving, his eyes fixed on something outside that the walls could not hide. Marcus slipped on his boots, buttoned his faded denim shirt, and stepped onto the porch with a steaming cup of black coffee still warming his hand. The cool Wyoming air carried no birdsong. Even the breeze seemed reluctant to cross the open valley. Then he saw the first headlights. They appeared over the eastern ridge like a slow-moving chain of white stars descending toward the ranch. 1 became 5. 5 became 20. Within minutes, trucks, sport utility vehicles, and utility trailers poured onto every county road surrounding the property. Dust rose into the morning sky as engines idled across the hillsides. Marcus quietly set his coffee mug on the porch railing without taking his eyes off the growing line of vehicles. He counted automatically, the habit of years spent observing details under pressure returning without effort. 53, 81, 120. The numbers continued climbing until it became impossible to keep pace. By the time the sun finally broke above the mountains, nearly 300 armed private security contractors, each legally equipped according to local regulations, had positioned themselves around the outer boundaries of the ranch. No one crossed the property line. No one shouted. No one pointed a weapon. They simply stood in carefully organized groups, wearing matching tactical clothing with no company logos and carrying radios that crackled with quiet instructions. The display alone sent a clear message. It was intimidation without a single law being openly broken. Marcus rested both hands on the porch rail and studied them carefully. Their formation was too disciplined to be spontaneous. Observation posts overlooked every approach. Vehicles blocked several public access roads without completely closing them. Portable communication antennas appeared beside two trailers. Someone had invested enormous time and money into creating this spectacle. Ranger released a low growl, but remained beside Marcus without stepping forward. A few minutes later, another black luxury sport utility vehicle climbed the driveway alone. Richard Caldwell stepped out looking as polished as he had the day before, his expensive coat untouched by the dust swirling around the valley. He smiled as though they were meeting for breakfast instead of standing in the middle of an extraordinary standoff. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," he called calmly. Marcus did not answer immediately. Richard glanced toward the surrounding hills with quiet satisfaction. "Quite a gathering, is it not?" Marcus finally spoke. "You brought an audience." Richard chuckled softly. "I brought witnesses. Investors become nervous when opportunities are delayed." Marcus looked past him toward the hundreds of silent figures spread across the landscape. "Looks expensive." "Not nearly as expensive as losing this property," Richard replied. "I wanted you to understand how serious everyone involved has become." Marcus remained perfectly still. "Everyone." Richard spread his hands. "People with interests. People with influence. People who believe progress should not be stopped by one stubborn rancher." Marcus looked directly into Richard's eyes. "Progress does not begin with pressure." For a brief second, the developer's pleasant expression faded before returning with practiced ease. "You still have time to reconsider. Sign the papers today, and all of this disappears before lunch." Marcus slowly shook his head. "No." The single word drifted across the morning air with surprising calm. Richard studied him for several silent seconds, as though searching for doubt that simply was not there. Instead, he found the same quiet confidence that had greeted him the previous morning. Without another argument, he climbed back into the waiting vehicle. As it rolled away, the hundreds of contractors remained exactly where they stood, silent figures surrounding generations of family history. Marcus watched them without anger or fear. Then he reached into his pocket, removed his phone, activated the camera, and slowly began recording every vehicle, every face visible from the porch, every license plate, every timestamp, knowing that sometimes the strongest response was not confrontation, but preserving the truth before anyone else could rewrite it. Marcus lowered his phone only after he had captured every angle visible from the porch. The recording was steady, methodical, and free of emotion, just as every after-action report he had ever completed during his years of military service. Panic blurred details. Discipline preserved them. He stepped back inside the ranch house and placed the phone on the kitchen table beside an old leather notebook filled with maintenance records, rainfall totals, cattle inventories, and handwritten notes from his father. The familiar smell of coffee and pine wood lingered in the room, grounding him in a place that had always represented peace rather than conflict. Outside, dozens of radios continued murmuring across the hills, their distant voices carried by the morning breeze like echoes from another world. Marcus reached for another device, a small satellite communicator he kept for emergencies in remote country. He sent a brief message to his attorney, Daniel Harper, a respected property rights lawyer in Cheyenne. It contained only 6 words. "Document everything. Situation escalating. Call immediately. Less than 2 minutes later, the communicator vibrated. Daniel answered without greeting. Marcus, I just saw your message. What is happening? Marcus calmly explained exactly what he could confirm and refused to speculate beyond the facts. He described the number of vehicles, the visible personnel, the location of each observation point, and the conversation with Richard Caldwell. Daniel listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, the attorney exhaled slowly. You have done the right thing. Do not provoke anyone. Keep recording. Every minute matters now. That was already the plan, Marcus replied. After ending the call, he opened every exterior security camera installed around the ranch. Years earlier, after a severe winter storm damaged part of the property, he had upgraded the system so he could monitor livestock remotely. Today, those same cameras quietly captured license plates, vehicle movements, timestamps, and changing positions around the ranch. Marcus backed up every file to secure cloud storage before copying another version onto an external drive. He believed in preparation because preparation removed fear from difficult decisions. Around mid-morning, a white pickup separated itself from the larger group and stopped just outside the property entrance. A middle-aged rancher climbed out, lifting both hands where everyone could see them before approaching the fence. Marcus recognized him immediately. It was his nearest neighbor, Samuel Brooks, whose family had grazed cattle on the next valley for nearly 40 years. Marcus, Samuel called across the fence. You holding up? Marcus nodded. I have seen quieter mornings. Samuel glanced uneasily toward the surrounding hills. Several folks in town are asking questions. Nobody seems to know who hired all these people. Marcus answered with complete honesty. I know who offered to buy the ranch. I only know what I have personally witnessed after that. Samuel slowly nodded. That is probably the smartest sentence anyone has spoken today. Before leaving, Samuel quietly placed 2 insulated containers beside the fence. Fresh coffee and breakfast sandwiches. Figured you might forget to eat. Marcus smiled for the first time since sunrise. Thank you. Neighbors look after neighbors, Samuel replied before driving away. Marcus carried the breakfast inside but paused beside a framed photograph hanging near the kitchen doorway. It showed 3 generations of the Reed family standing beneath the same American flag, now waving outside the porch. His grandfather wore overalls. His father wore a weathered ranch jacket. Marcus stood between them in his navy dress uniform, younger then, smiling without realizing how precious ordinary moments would someday become. He looked out the window again. Hundreds of strangers still surrounded the property, but inside the ranch nothing had changed. Integrity still mattered. Patience still mattered. Truth still mattered. Marcus quietly returned to the porch, resumed recording the scene before him, and waited with the calm certainty that every decision made by those outside the fence was leaving behind evidence they had not intended anyone to notice. Before we continue, if you enjoy inspiring stories about courage, second chances, and people who choose kindness when it matters most, subscribe to Narralight. Our stories remind us that one decision, one voice, or one act of compassion can change a life forever. Now, let's see what happened next. The afternoon sun climbed higher, washing the Wyoming Valley in bright golden light, yet the atmosphere surrounding the Reed Ranch remained strangely cold. From a distance, the gathering almost resembled a large construction project waiting to begin, but Marcus knew appearances could be carefully manufactured. What mattered were facts, and facts had a way of surviving long after performances ended. He carried a folding chair onto the porch, placed his camera on a sturdy tripod, and aimed it toward the entrance road. Every few minutes, he slowly adjusted the angle, capturing another section of the surrounding hills. The routine looked almost ordinary, but each recording quietly preserved another layer of evidence. Across the valley, several members of the private security detail shifted positions throughout the afternoon. Some exchanged vehicles. Others unloaded portable equipment from enclosed trailers before setting up temporary communication stations beside the road. None of those actions directly involved Marcus or crossed onto his property, but every movement left behind details that could later be verified. License plates appeared briefly before trucks changed parking positions. Radio call signs drifted across open channels. Company logos had been removed from uniforms, yet several serial numbers remained visible on supply cases whenever sunlight struck the metal handles at the right angle. Marcus noticed them all. Shortly after 2 o'clock, a local television helicopter appeared far above the valley, circling only once before continuing south. Within minutes, several contractors quickly repositioned vehicles beneath trees and temporary awnings, reducing visibility from above. Marcus quietly smiled. That single reaction told him something important. Whoever organized this operation preferred attention only when they controlled the narrative. He opened his notebook and wrote one simple sentence beneath the current time. They changed behavior after media observation. Inside the ranch house, his laptop displayed a growing collection of synchronized security footage. Every camera recorded a different angle. One overlooked the front gate. Another monitored the western pasture. A third faced the gravel road leading toward the highway. Marcus carefully compared timestamps until a small inconsistency caught his attention. At exactly 11:23 that morning, one white utility truck had briefly entered the outer staging area, carrying empty equipment racks. 15 minutes later, the same truck departed with several sealed storage containers secured beneath heavy tarps. Curious, Marcus enlarged the image frame by frame. As the truck exited, one corner of a tarp shifted in the wind just enough to expose a stack of printed property maps marked with colored boundary lines matching his own ranch. He immediately copied the video segment into a separate evidence folder. Meanwhile, Daniel Harper called again. "Marcus, county records are beginning to tell an interesting story," the attorney said. "Richard Caldwell recently created 3 different holding companies. Each one purchased land surrounding your ranch over the last 8 months. Your property is the missing piece connecting everything." Marcus looked out the kitchen window toward the distant hills. "So this was planned long before yesterday." "Much longer," Daniel answered. "And there is something else. Several easement applications were submitted before anyone could have reasonably expected you to sell. Somebody assumed your answer in advance." Marcus remained silent for several seconds. Confidence without certainty often revealed more than words ever could. "Keep digging," he finally said. "I intend to." As evening approached, long shadows stretched across the pasture while the American flag beside the porch fluttered gently in the cooling breeze. Ranger rested at Marcus's feet, finally relaxing for the first time all day. Then the satellite communicator vibrated again. This message did not come from Daniel. It came from an old contact whose name Marcus had not seen in years. Colonel Nathan Brooks, retired. The brief message contained only one sentence. "I saw the footage. Stay patient. The truth is already moving toward you." Marcus looked once more across the valley where the organized display of pressure still surrounded generations of family history. They believed they were tightening the circle around one rancher. They never realized that with every careful move they made, they were quietly drawing an even larger circle around themselves. Rain arrived just before sunset, not as a violent storm, but as a slow curtain of silver that softened the sharp edges of the valley. One drop struck the porch railing, then another, until the weather would darken beneath a steady rhythm that seemed to quiet everything at once. The conversations carried by distant radios became muffled beneath the falling rain. Vehicle engines gradually shut down. Even the scattered groups stationed across the surrounding hills retreated beneath portable shelters, their movements slower now, less certain than they had been that morning. Marcus remained on the porch in an old wooden rocking chair his father had built decades earlier. He wore the same faded ranch jacket despite the cooling air, his hands wrapped around a warm mug of black coffee that had long since stopped steaming. Ranger rested beside his boots, breathing slowly, finally at peace with the silence returning to the land. Marcus looked beyond the fence toward the open pasture where rain blurred the horizon into soft shades of gray and green. It reminded him of another rainy evening years before, shortly after returning home from his final deployment. He had stood on this very porch wearing a navy duffel bag over one shoulder while his father quietly handed him a small envelope. Inside had been the original deed to the ranch, folded carefully with yellowed edges from generations of safekeeping. His father had smiled without saying much. He never believed important lessons required long speeches. After several quiet moments, he simply said, "This paper does not make this land yours. Your choices will." At the time, Marcus thought he understood those words. Sitting here now, surrounded by strangers who believed ownership could be measured in contracts and money, he finally understood what his father had truly meant. Land was never about possession. It was about responsibility. It held family stories, promises, sacrifices, and memories that could never appear on financial statements or development plans. A flash of lightning illuminated the distant hills for only a second before fading back into gentle rain. Across the valley, one contractor removed his cap and quietly watched the ranch from beneath a temporary canopy. Another accepted a hot cup of coffee from a coworker. For the first time all day, they no longer looked like an overwhelming force. They looked like ordinary people standing in uncomfortable weather, following instructions written by someone far away. Marcus felt no anger toward them. Whatever reasons had brought each individual here belonged to their own lives. His concern remained with the choices made by those who had organized the situation, believing pressure could replace fairness. He quietly stood, walked to the flagpole beside the porch, and adjusted the halyard where the rain had twisted it around the pole. The American flag unfurled again in the damp evening breeze, its colors muted beneath the clouds, yet still unmistakable. Marcus rested one hand against the cool metal pole and closed his eyes for only a moment. He remembered fellow service members from every background imaginable, men and women who had trusted one another because character mattered more than appearance, more than hometowns, more than anything else. They had protected principles, not pride. They had believed that the law existed to defend ordinary people when power forgot its limits. A soft vibration interrupted the quiet. His phone displayed dozens of missed calls and messages from people he had not heard from in years. Former teammates, old neighbors, veterans, local ranchers, journalists requesting interviews, complete strangers offering encouragement after seeing brief clips that had already begun circulating online. Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed the phone face down on the porch table and watched the rain continue washing dust from the fence posts and wild grass. Truth rarely arrived all at once. Like rain on dry ground, it spread quietly, reached places no one expected, and changed the landscape without making a sound. Somewhere beyond the darkening clouds, he sensed that the balance had already begun to shift, even if almost no one standing outside the ranch had realized it yet. The rain stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the valley washed clean beneath a pale blue sky. Sunlight reflected from every blade of grass, and for the first time in 2 days the air smelled fresh instead of tense. Marcus stepped onto the porch carrying nothing except another mug of coffee. The contractors were still positioned around the property, but something had changed overnight. Their radios were busier. Small groups gathered beside trucks, speaking quietly before separating again. Several drivers checked their phones repeatedly. Confidence had been replaced by uncertainty, and uncertainty spread faster than any order could contain. Inside the ranch house, Marcus's phone vibrated almost continuously across the kitchen table. Overnight, the short video clips he had uploaded to document the events had spread far beyond Wyoming. Local reporters had shared them first. Veteran organizations followed. Property rights advocates reposted the footage. Then former military personnel from every corner of the country began recognizing the calm man standing alone on the porch. They were not discussing confrontation. They were discussing discipline, restraint, and the importance of documenting facts instead of escalating conflict. Among the thousands of messages, one notification immediately caught Marcus's attention. Colonel Nathan Brooks was requesting a secure video call. Marcus answered. The retired officer appeared on the screen from a modest office lined with military photographs and worn bookshelves. His expression remained calm, but there was unmistakable urgency behind his eyes. "Marcus," he said, "I have spent the entire night making calls." Marcus nodded once. "I figured you might." Nathan leaned forward. Several people recognized Richard Caldwell's name, not because of real estate, because of complaints that never seemed to reach public attention. Marcus listened silently. Former landowners, small ranches, family farms. Nearly every deal followed the same pattern. Pressure, isolation, aggressive negotiations, then rapid purchases through newly created holding companies. Marcus remembered Daniel Harper mentioning the same companies only hours earlier. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Nathan continued. One retired county surveyor kept copies of documents after becoming uncomfortable with unusual boundary revisions. Another former employee contacted me this morning after watching your footage. He says internal planning maps existed before negotiations ever began. Marcus remained quiet for several moments before asking a single question. Can they prove it? Nathan answered without hesitation. They already sent everything to investigators. At nearly the same moment, Daniel Harper called through the second line. Marcus merged both conversations together. You are both going to want to hear this, Daniel said. Papers shuffled in the background as he continued. County officials confirmed that 2 easement applications connected to Caldwell's companies contained conflicting property descriptions. They referenced land that was never legally transferred. Someone prepared paperwork based on ownership they did not actually have. Nathan exchanged a knowing glance through the video screen. That changes everything, Daniel agreed. It certainly changes the questions investigators will begin asking. Outside, movement spread quickly across the surrounding hills. Several contractors climbed into vehicles, while others folded temporary canopies that had remained standing since the previous morning. Nobody appeared rushed, yet the organized certainty Marcus had witnessed before was clearly fading. Through binoculars, he noticed one supervisor pacing beside a truck while speaking intensely into a satellite phone. Minutes later, another vehicle departed unexpectedly, followed by 3 more. The carefully arranged display was beginning to unravel from the inside. Marcus lowered the binoculars and looked across the pasture where sunlight now shimmered on puddles left behind by the night's rain. He understood that evidence possessed a quiet kind of strength. It did not argue. It did not threaten. It simply waited until enough pieces stood together that the truth became impossible to ignore. Ranger brushed gently against his leg, sensing the change before any official announcement arrived. Marcus smiled faintly and rested a hand on the old dog's head. The valley still looked peaceful, but somewhere beyond the distant highway, investigators, attorneys, and witnesses were already moving toward the same destination. The people who believed they had surrounded one man were slowly discovering that the truth had surrounded them first. By mid-afternoon, the valley looked nothing like it had 24 hours earlier. The long rows of parked vehicles that had once projected confidence were slowly disappearing down the county roads in small groups. Portable communication towers were folded and loaded onto trailers. Temporary shelters vanished one after another until only tire tracks remained pressed into the wet ground. No loud announcements explained the sudden change. No dramatic speeches echoed across the hills. The silence itself told the story. Marcus stood near the front fence with Ranger beside him, watching the transformation without celebration. He had learned long ago that real victories rarely arrived with applause. They arrived quietly, one decision at a time. A dark sedan soon approached the entrance, followed by 2 county vehicles carrying official markings. Several investigators stepped out carrying folders instead of urgency. Their expressions were professional, calm, and respectful. One woman introduced herself as Special Investigator Laura Mitchell. She extended her hand. Mr. Reed, thank you for preserving everything exactly as it happened. Marcus shook her hand. I believe the facts would eventually matter. Laura nodded. They already do. She explained that investigators had received documentation from multiple independent sources overnight. Property records, internal planning maps, witness statements, financial transfers, and digital communications had begun forming a consistent picture. Several former employees had voluntarily come forward after recognizing details from Marcus's recordings. Others had shared emails indicating that acquisition plans had been discussed months before negotiations officially began. None of those findings alone determined legal responsibility, but together they justified a formal investigation into the actions of several individuals connected to the project. Marcus listened without interrupting. He appreciated precision more than promises. While they spoke, another county vehicle stopped farther down the road where Richard Caldwell's sport utility vehicle had just arrived. Richard stepped out wearing the same tailored suit that had seemed so confident only days earlier. This time there was no practiced smile. He glanced across the valley as investigators approached him with calm professionalism. The conversation remained too far away for Marcus to hear, but he noticed something unmistakable. Richard's posture changed. His shoulders lowered. His confident gestures disappeared. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, he looked less like a man directing events and more like someone being asked difficult questions. Nearby, several contractors quietly removed identifying badges from temporary equipment before loading the final cases into waiting trucks. Some looked embarrassed. Others simply looked tired. Marcus felt no satisfaction watching them leave. He understood that many people had likely accepted work without knowing the full picture. Responsibility belonged to the choices each individual had made, and the investigation would determine those choices fairly. As the last convoy disappeared beyond the western ridge, the valley finally sounded like itself again. Cattle wandered peacefully through the pasture. Meadowlarks returned to the fence posts. Wind rolled gently across the tall grass, carrying away the last traces of diesel exhaust. Samuel Brooks drove over once more, stepping out with 2 fresh cups of coffee balanced carefully in his hands. He looked around the open valley and smiled. Feels like the ranch can breathe again. Marcus accepted the coffee with quiet gratitude. So can I. Samuel studied him for a moment before asking, "You angry?" Marcus looked across the fields where 3 generations of his family had built an honest life. He slowly shook his head. No. Angry people spend too much time carrying what belongs in the past. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. Then what are you carrying? Marcus looked toward the weathered farmhouse, the American flag moving gently beside the porch, and the land his family had entrusted to him. Responsibility, he answered softly. That is enough. The evening sun dipped toward the mountains, bathing the ranch in warm golden light that reflected from every rain-washed fence post. Nothing about the buildings had changed. Nothing about the fields looked different. Yet everything felt renewed because the land had never needed someone to fight for it with anger. It had only needed someone willing to stand patiently for the truth until the truth could finally stand on its own. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Narralight for more powerful stories that remind us to look beyond appearances, challenge prejudice, and never underestimate the impact of doing what's right. Because sometimes, the smallest act of courage creates the biggest change. Thank you for watching. Remember, the world changes one choice at a time. We'll see you in the next story. 3 weeks later, the ranch looked exactly as it had before the strangers ever appeared. Morning sunlight stretched across the open fields, turning the dew into thousands of tiny points of light that shimmered beneath the wide Wyoming sky. The fences stood straight once again after Marcus spent several quiet afternoons replacing weathered posts and tightening loose wire with the same careful patience his father had taught him as a boy. The gravel driveway carried only familiar tire tracks now. Cattle grazed peacefully near the western pasture. Ranger wandered ahead with the slow confidence of an old dog who finally believed every visitor belonged there. The valley had found its voice again. Meadowlarks filled the air with songs that had been absent during those tense days, and the steady wind moved through the tall grass with a sound that reminded Marcus of gentle waves rolling onto a distant shoreline. He paused beside the old oak tree overlooking the ranch house, its thick branches casting cool shadows across the hillside. Years earlier, his grandfather had planted that tree with little more than hope and a shovel, telling the family that some things were worth growing even if the person planting them might never enjoy the shade. Marcus rested one hand against the rough bark and smiled quietly. Some promises lasted longer than lifetimes. His phone buzzed softly inside his jacket pocket. The investigation had continued exactly as the officials promised. Multiple individuals connected to the land acquisition scheme now faced legal proceedings based on evidence gathered through proper channels, witness testimony, and documented records. Several former employees who had once remained silent had chosen to cooperate fully after realizing the truth mattered more than protecting reputations. Marcus read the latest update without celebration. He simply locked the screen and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Justice, he believed, was never about watching someone fall. It was about making certain the truth could stand where fear once stood. Later that afternoon, a familiar pickup truck rolled into the driveway. Samuel Brooks climbed out carrying a small cardboard box. "Thought you might want these back," he said with a grin. Inside were homemade pies baked by neighbors from across the county, handwritten thank you letters from veterans organizations, drawings mailed by school children who had watched the story unfold, and a folded American flag signed by members of Marcus's former unit with one simple message written across the white fabric. Integrity never stands alone. Marcus stared at the words for several long seconds before carefully folding the flag again. "I do not know what to say," he admitted. Samuel smiled. "You already said it. You just lived it instead." That evening, as the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains, Marcus walked toward the highest point on the property, carrying nothing except a small shovel and a young oak sapling. He chose a place overlooking the valley where the old tree could still be seen in the distance. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the work took only a few quiet minutes. When the tree stood upright, he packed the soil gently around its roots and poured fresh water from a metal bucket before stepping back to admire it. One day, long after he was gone, someone else would stand beneath its branches and remember that the strongest things in life were not built through fear or force. They were built through patience, honesty, and the courage to remain steady when everything around them demanded surrender. As twilight settled across the ranch, Marcus looked once more at the fields stretching toward the horizon. Nothing about the land had changed, yet everything felt different because the greatest victory had never been keeping the ranch. It had been refusing to let someone else define its value. The camera of memory seemed to drift higher with the evening wind, revealing the farmhouse glowing warmly beneath the fading sky, the flag moving gently beside the porch, the cattle wandering peacefully across the open pasture, and one quiet man walking home with his faithful dog, leaving behind no speech, no celebration, and no bitterness, only the silent proof that kindness is never weakness, integrity never goes out of style, and the strongest people are often the ones who choose dignity over revenge.